It's clearly a desecration of international law and international norms and further attempts to bully its neighbors.
The Transparency Initiative is an element in Manila's overarching approach towards the West Philippine Sea.
They are checking the weak point of Japan defense line, like the Soviet did in the past.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. This dramatic footage captures a collision between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine vessel BRP Teresa Magbanua near Sabina Shoal on August 31st. The Philippine Coast Guard says the video they released shows the Chinese vessel surrounding, then ramming the flagship 3 times, creating a breach in its hull. 2 weeks later, the ship was pulled out of Sabina Shoal. The Philippine Coast Guard says the BRP Teresa Magbanua will resume her mission in the contested waters, which they call the West Philippine Sea. This clash highlights escalating tensions in the contested waters of the South China Sea, or as the Philippines calls it, the West Philippine Sea. Now, to discuss the disputed waters and China's claims, we're joined by Don McLain Gill, lecturer at De La Salle University in Manila, and Robert D. Eldridge, director at the Hawaii-based Global Risk Mitigation Foundation, speaking to us from Taipei. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being on the program. I'm going to start with you, Don, here, and particularly about this incident. The shoal is well within the Philippines' economic zone. We've seen other disputes in these disputed territorial waters, or non-territorial waters as they may be. But how does this raise the stakes for Manila?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here, Divya. It's great to join Dr. Eldridge as well. Now, we have to understand that the month of August has witnessed 4 major physical provocations from the Chinese Coast Guard against Philippine ships, Philippine government ships as well, and particularly more recently, the BRP Teresa Magbanua, which is the largest Philippine Coast Guard vessel. Now, as you have rightfully mentioned, the Sabina Shoal is well within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile lawful exclusive economic zone. And these activities actually were simmering as early as April, when the Philippine Coast Guard was quick to realize China's intended reclamation activities on the Sabina Shoal. There were also sightings of Chinese researchers along the area. And if we understand, based on UNCLOS, any researches taken by foreign actors within the exclusive economic zone of a coastal state must therefore seek permission from the coastal state. So recognizing what had occurred in 2012 when China sought to, or at least de facto, occupy the Scarborough Shoal, the Philippine Coast Guard was quick to deploy the BRP Teresa Magbanua at the Sabina Shoal. China was very frustrated, obviously, because it wanted to pursue its reclamation activities discreetly. But with the spotlight on China at this particular area, it has shown that level of frustration. Now, more interestingly, the provocations took place after the July 21 provisional arrangement between Manila and Beijing for the Second Thomas Shoal, or what we call the Sabina Shoal. So what I can see here is that this is China's way of illustrating that, one, the arrangement does not in any way limit China's expansionist ambitions in the West Philippine Sea, and 2, China is showing that it seeks to offset its strategic losses in the Ayungin Shoal right now by projecting more power in the Sabina Shoal. Hopefully, it seeks to drive out Philippine position there by cutting off the supplies to the Teresa Magbanua and creating structural damages to Philippine Coast Guard ships, but given the limited resources that the Philippines has. So I think the time is now quite crucial, coupled with the air provocations on top of the airspace of the Bao de Masinloc.
But Robert, let's talk about the actions of the Chinese on the shoal. Can you tell me about China's strategy when it comes to trying to stop or limit the Philippines from having a permanent presence in the shoal, and what their strategy is in trying to exert their presence in these areas?
This is extremely typical, I think, of Chinese activities in recent years, also in recent decades, you could say. It's highlighting its efforts to use force, essentially making right over potentially weaker countries, smaller countries. in this particular case over territorial claims. The Sabina Shoal efforts there to reclaim that area, which is larger than Mischief Reef, closer to the Philippines, is a very dangerous, provocative, and aggressive action by China. And I think it sent a lot of warning signals to all the countries in the region. I think what it's trying to do, obviously, as Professor Gill mentioned, is to recoup some of its recent losses. It's also trying to pressure the Philippines, possibly isolate the Philippines from the United States, possibly drive the United States out of the region. It's clearly a desecration of international law and international norms, and further attempts to bully its neighbors.
Don, I want to refer back to the video we showed, which was supplied by the Philippines Coast Guard, and it's seen as part of Manila's assertive transparency approach. Can you explain that strategy and how effective it's been?
Well, that's a very interesting question. The transparency initiative is an element in Manila's overarching approach towards the West Philippine Sea. Now, we have to understand that China's belligerence and its provocations against Philippine national interests in the West Philippine Sea is not confined to the physical domain. It has been also proliferating its information and disinformation operations within the Philippines to sow public discord. Now, one of the major objectives of the Transparency Initiative is to inform the public audience, the Filipino public, about what is actually taking place on the ground or at sea. Now, China has been able to, of course, take advantage in the past over the more appeasing approach of the previous administration. But today we can clearly see that public opinion has elevated the discourse of the West Philippine Sea as a major interest point when it comes to public discourse. So this is in fact very important and one of the key successes of the Transparency Initiative. And this is why, despite information operations deepening within the Philippines, public opinion still remains relatively resilient against these information operations. And at the same time, this is also an opportunity for the Philippines to highlight that China's desire to at least present itself as a leader of the global South or as a security provider, a development provider, are all unjustified. And particularly, this has completely stripped China out of any sort of legitimacy in claiming to be a leader of the global South, given that its primary targets are those countries of the global South, and it seeks to throw its weight around, as Dr. Eldridge has rightfully said. So this in itself would be one of the success points of the Transparency Initiative, but the Transparency Initiative must be continuously coupled with a more robust level of physical deterrence. And I think that that's the whole idea, given that it is an element of the overarching approach.
Definitely. But before we move on, Robert, I want to take it back to the basics here. Can you explain why there is so much claim or so much dispute in these water over shoals that dot the South China Sea, essentially, which are sandbars or sandbanks?
Yes. Obviously, historically, China tends to extend its claims over a very wide area. Historically, this is the case, and certainly in recent decades in the so-called South China Sea, as well as in the East China Sea, for example. The real risk, in addition to economic interests, has to do with the ability to control the sea lanes, shipping, resources in that area. It wants to overchange the status quo. So the rules and norms that have built up, certainly the post-war period, China's is attempting to overturn that. in China's favor and essentially become a hegemon. If China was supporting international norms, the international system, and being a responsible player, maybe the risks wouldn't be as large. But again, as we saw with Mischief Reef, it immediately militarized that area, and it's a clear threat to countries in the region and shipping in the region. And going back to Sabina Shoal, because it's that much more geographically closer to the Philippines, it presents a huge threat, not only to the Philippines, but to countries that are friendly to the Philippines, that are allied to the Philippines, and any country that really wants to conduct trade throughout the region. It also sends a very strong negative message to smaller countries that are also claimants to other islands or territories in the region vis-a-vis China, that China will use force, will overtake their claims and basically force them to stand down. And as I mentioned at the outset, it has a potential of removing the United States from the region. And that would be very risky for a lot of the countries in the region that are increasingly turning their attention to strengthening ties with the United States. So I think China's ultimate goal is to essentially rid the region of the United States.
All right, so that's a point I want to take to Don here. I mean, if we go back to the Sabina Shoal, it can only be resupplied at the moment by air, by helicopters, which is very risky. The Philippines doesn't have the capacity or the number of ships to confront China in any meaningful way, or any way that could eventually lead to conflict anyway. So are they asking the U.S. for help? And what is the U.S.'s position on this from the point of view of Manila?
Well, that's quite interesting, because we have to understand that the U.S. has recently voiced its support for engaging in such escort operations with the Philippines, recognizing that China is more susceptible to physical deterrence. And of course, given the limited resources of the Philippines, it is a practical and pragmatic step to have the U.S. part of its escort missions. Now, unfortunately, we have to understand that this is based on a computation of bilateral relations and the foreign policy calculations of the Philippines. Now, currently, Manila has said that while we remain open to such possibilities, we would want to maximize whatever we can on our own for now before committing to such a robust level of bilateral cooperation in terms of resupply missions and all that. So definitely, it is the Philippines is not against it. The armed forces of the Philippines has voiced its support for such an idea, but I guess it's about the matter of timing. Given, of course, that the Philippines would still want to exhaust a number of options that it feels could still be incorporated on its own.
Okay, so let's look at the U.S.'s point of view, Robert. Would the U.S. want to step in sooner rather than later, or perhaps if the Philippines does reach out and ask for some support and backing?
Yeah, and I agree with Professor Gill's point. The priority is on the Philippines. How does it want to handle this? How does it want to respond? What does it need to make its response felt more strongly and clearly vis-a-vis China as well as internationally? So the U.S. shouldn't do more than what the Philippines wants and asks for. Domestically within the Philippines, I believe, and Professor Gill can probably elaborate on this, the Marcos presidency is probably walking a fine line, a tightrope with regard to domestic politics. There are some forces within the Philippines that see this tension as more of a conflict between China and the United States. Others in the Philippines do not want to see the Philippines rely too much or heavily on the United States. There are others who think that the U.S. Could abandon the Philippines and go over the Philippines' heads. So there's probably a lot of different opinions within the Philippines that the Marcos government has to navigate, and therefore the U.S. would do well, I think, by honoring and respecting what the Philippines government wants. But assuming that there's a request for more assistance, I believe the U.S. should do everything in its power to support the Philippines.
Well, China is agitating players beyond the Philippines. Also, at the end of last month, a Chinese Navy survey ship entered Japan's territorial waters off its southwestern islands. Now, that took place less than a week after Tokyo strongly protested against the Chinese military aircraft's airspace breach. Satoru Nagao, a non-resident fellow of the Washington, D.C.-based Hudson Institute, explains how those incidents are being viewed in Tokyo.
This territorial area China hasn't claimed as their territory. So China also admits this is the territorial area of Japan. That's why this is the first time and very important. In the territorial area around the Senkaku Island, yes, China has already entered 2 times. But in this case, China claimed the Senkaku Island as their territory since the 1970s. But this time, they try to enter another area, which is Kyushu. The official stance of China also admits this is Japan's territorial area, but they try to enter it. So what is the purpose? They are checking the weak point of Japan's defense line, like the Soviet did in the past. So if China continue to enter Japan's territorial area like this time, there is a high possibility that in the future, they will find the weak point of Japan's defense line. Of course, Japanese side believe there is no weak point. But there is no perfect defense line. So that's why this is very serious.
Right. So, Robert, since you know that area is one of your focuses, what's your take? Is this China's forays we've seen both on the sea and in the airspace, is that a way of trying to test Japan's defenses?
It normalizes its incursions on a daily basis, as it does, vis-a-vis Taiwan as well. And it's also, as Dr. Nagao mentions, probing the defense line just to see where these vulnerable points are. And also, as it does vis-a-vis Taiwan, it's attempting to wear down the military forces or the Coast Guard of the respective countries. For example, with the Philippines, it's, as was mentioned before, it's a smaller force, and so it has to scramble more. It has less people to scramble. It has less equipment to use, and doing it on a regular basis wears down that equipment, and it wears down the men and women making up the units that have to respond. That's the same with Japan's case as well. So China's doing quite a few different things, I think, at the same time. And incidentally, the patrol ship that was mentioned at the outset, I think as many people know, that ship was originally provided by Japan. And so the incidents in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, and the East China Sea near Japan are in many ways, on many levels, very much interrelated.
Right. So in that sense, Don, then how are the other forays we're seeing China or the other moves that China is doing in other territorial waters or disputed waters being seen from Manila's point of view? And what should the takeaway be for Taiwan, you think?
So China is always on the lookout for particular gaps that could be exploited. And the timing, I believe, of what has been taking place against Japan is also in line with the potential transition of leadership in Japan as well. So China has this attitude of trying to coerce and intimidate its target into, as Dr. Eldridge has exactly and perfectly said, bending the will, bending the political will, because China has so far been able to alter not just the geography, but also the balance of power of the Western Pacific without the overt use of military force. So these intimidation tactics, wearing the target down, as what China calls the cabbage strategy, that's very much integral in Beijing's overarching expansionist designs. So I believe that like-minded countries, and from the Philippine perspective, it is very much important to work closely with Japan, with Taiwan, with the United States particularly, making up that first island chain that Dr. Eldridge has exactly and wonderfully articulated, would be crucial for the long-term stability of the region. But of course, China is always on the lookout for areas for exploitation. Now, it would be depending on the ability of the partners, like-minded partners, to consolidate a more integrated approach to apply more physical cost on China's belligerent activities.
Right. So speaking of basically the U.S.'s viewpoint or the U.S.'s stance, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan went to Beijing at the end of August, and just 2 days after he left on August 31st, it was the Sabina Shoal incident. So, Robert, what does that say to you about diplomacy with Beijing, with China, particularly Washington-China diplomacy, and whether how effective that is in monitoring or moderating what's happening in these disputed waters?
China, unfortunately, only responds to force. It takes advantage of dialogue and looks at dialogue as and conversations essentially as a weakness in the other country, and so it looks at the U.S. Basically as a declining, weak power, a paper tiger, that it doesn't follow through on its statements in defense of other countries. And I think China sees through the U.S., on that. So a lot of us who were, watching Mr. Sullivan's visit, expected something like that to happen afterwards. The fundamental problem, I think, with the Biden administration's approach to China is that they're unwilling to recognize the main truth that's out there. In other words, that China has already started a war against the world and against countries that, in particular, in this region. The war that they started began many years ago, political warfare, lawfare, economic warfare. And so we're already at war with China, but the Biden administration still emphasizes dialogue when China's not even playing by dialogue anymore. It's using force. And the U.S. has to step up its game. Ironically, and fortunately, China's actions, speak louder than words. And so the countries in the region are completely re-examining their relations with China and the relations among themselves. So they're developing greater and greater cooperation among themselves. They're also aligning themselves more with the United States than they have been in the past. And so in many ways, it's a great irony, but we have to be thankful to China for, causing the region to coalesce against China.
And to that point, Don, when we talk about countries examining their relations with China, China has called on the Philippines to, quote unquote, seriously consider the future of its relationship at a crossroads with Beijing. What do you think that means, and how do you think that bodes well for the future diplomacy between the two?
Well, this is just another extension of China trying to dictate the terms of engagement based on its own narrow-driven interests. And clearly, when the Philippines is doing something that is based on international law for the benefit of Philippine security, for the protection of its sovereignty, sovereign rights, and for the Filipino people, this does not really bode well for China. Because for China, a good relationship is a relationship where it gets to dictate on its partner what the partner should do and how it should do it. So clearly, Manila under President Marcos Jr. has been showing that while we engage with China on several different fronts, even in the economic realm, this does not mean that we could not stand up or we would not stand up to China's expansionist ambitions in the lawful West Philippine Sea, which encompasses our lawful exclusive economic zone. Based on UNCLOS and based on the 2016 arbitral ruling. So clearly these sort of activities does not really hold well for China, especially as China does not seek to have amiable relations. And the idea that the provisional arrangement, for instance, which was talked about, could be extended in other parts of the West Philippine Sea, I've often argued that that would only work practically if both parties are really interested in forging close, functional, and sustainable relationship for regional peace and stability. China does not care about that. It merely responds to risk. As Dr. Eldridge has said, China responds to force. So basically, this is not a relationship that is really sustainable for keeping the environment peaceful and rules-based. So given this reality, Manila has learned to accept and understand China's behavior, not based on what it says, but based on what it does.
And we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Don McLain, Gill lecturer at De La Salle University in Manila, and Robert D. Eldridge, director at the Global Risk Mitigation Foundation, speaking to us from Taipei. Thank you both so much for your time and insight. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.